The dust of Kansas still felt settled in the folds of her dress, a ghost of a life that had vanished like smoke. Abigail Monroe was 28 years old, but some days she felt she had lived a century. The West was not a choice born of courage, but of necessity. It was a vast, empty page where a woman with nothing left to lose could perhaps write a new line for herself, however small. The train had left her in a place called Dustwater, a name that tasted of bitter irony. There was only dust, and the water was a memory whispered from a cracked well. Arizona in 1885 was a crucible. The sun was not a gentle warmth, but a hammer that beat down on the land, forging it into something hard and unforgiving. Dustwater was a handful of sun-bleached buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the immense, silent expanse of the Sonoran Desert. The town offered little for a widow with clean hands and no prospects. The saloon keeper had looked her over with a dismissive eye. The general store owner had shaken his head, and the respectable women of the town had offered only pity, a currency that could not buy a loaf of bread. It was Dr. Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of exhaustion, who had mentioned the job. He spoke of it in a low voice. After he had confirmed she had no other options, an old man, he had said, needed a caretaker. The pay was steady, sent by some government agency or a charity back east. He was not sure which. It was a simple job. Cooking, cleaning, seeing that he took his medicine. The catch, and there was always a catch in this land, was the man himself. He was an Apache, Tulan, 80 years old, the doctor guessed, and living alone in a cabin a few miles out in the desert. He had been in one of the army camps for a time, a place people did not speak of. He did not speak much at all, the doctor had warned, and the townsfolk, they kept their distance. Abigail had felt a knot of cold fear tighten in her stomach. The stories she had heard back east, tales whispered around the fire of savage raids and unholy rituals, came rushing back. But fear was a luxury she could not afford. Hunger was a more immediate and demanding master. She had nodded, her face betraying none of the turmoil within. She would take the job. The journey to the cabin was a lesson in insignificance. A hired buckboard carried her and her single valise out of Dustwater, leaving the last vestiges of what passed for civilization behind. The desert opened up around them, a world of pale sand, skeletal saguaro cacti reaching for a merciless sky, and distant, heat-hazed mountains the color of old bruises. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the whisper of a wind that felt as if it blew from the mouth of a furnace. It was a landscape that did not care if you lived or died. It had seen empires of rock rise and fall, and the fleeting life of a woman from Kansas was less than a grain of sand in its measure. The driver, a taciturn man named Silas, pointed a long finger toward a shimmer of heat. "That is it," he said, his first words in over an hour. He would go no further. He helped her down, placing her valise in the dust with a thud that seemed to startle the silence. He looked at her one last time, a flicker of something, maybe pity, in his eyes, before he turned the horses and retreated back toward the town, leaving her utterly alone. The cabin was a tired, gray structure, leaning into the wind as if weary of standing. It seemed less built and more to have simply grown out of the scorched earth. Weathered wood, the color of bone, sagged in the heat as Abigail approached, her boots sinking into the soft, warm sand. She saw the eyes first. They were watching her from the shaded doorway. They were old eyes, set deep in a face that was a testament to the sun and the wind, a topography of wrinkles and scars. They were as dark and sharp as shards of obsidian, and they held no welcome. They simply watched, assessing, weighing. This was Tuhalan. He was smaller than she had imagined, frail even, wrapped in a simple blanket despite the oppressive heat. But there was a stillness to him, a rootedness, that made the very air around him seem heavy and ancient. She stopped a few feet from the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She introduced herself, her voice thin and strange in the vast silence. Her name was Abigail Monroe. Dr. Miller had sent her. He did not reply. He did not move. He only held her in that unnerving, penetrating gaze. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse her, would simply turn and disappear into the shadows of the cabin. She stood her ground, the sun beating on her bonnet, her hands clenched at her sides. Finally, with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, he stepped back from the doorway, a silent invitation into his world. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke, herbs, and something else, something wild and earthy she could not name. It was spare, containing only a cot, a rough-hewn table, a few clay pots, and a stone hearth. The work, as the doctor had said, was simple on its face. She fetched water from a deep, cool well behind the cabin. She learned to cook over the open fire, making thin corn cakes and a stew from the dried meat and beans he kept in a sack. She swept the packed earth floor and tidied his few possessions. She prepared the bitter herbal medicine he drank each evening without complaint. In all this, he remained a silent observer. He would sit by the window, watching the sun crawl across the desert floor, his hands resting in his lap. Gnarled and still, he moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his footsteps making no sound. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the fiery sun. The silence was the loudest thing in the cabin. It was not an empty silence, but a living presence, thick with unspoken history and the weight of years. Abigail found herself filling it with the noise of her own thoughts, her own memories of a husband lost to fever, of a green farm that was now a world away. Sometimes, to escape the suffocating quiet, she would step outside. The desert was a different creature up close. It was not empty, but teeming with a fierce, tenacious life. Lizards skittered over hot rocks. Strange. Thorny plants bloomed with a sudden, breathtaking beauty. The wind carried the scent of dust and sage. The sky at sunset was a cataclysm of color. Great swaths of orange and crimson and purple painted across the heavens. So beautiful it made her ache. It was during these moments outside that she began to notice the marks on the weathered wood of the cabin walls, on the smooth, flat stones that lined the path to the well. Symbols were carved. They were not letters she recognized, but intricate patterns of spirals, sunbursts, and figures that seemed both human and animal. They were etched with a careful, patient hand. They seemed to possess a meaning that was just beyond her grasp, a silent language spoken between the old man and the land itself. She would trace them with her finger, feeling the texture of the wood and stone, a strange shiver running through her. When she looked up, she would sometimes find him watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He never spoke of them. He never spoke of anything. He ate what she cooked, drank what she poured, and watched. He watched the way she moved, the way she worked, the way she looked out at the horizon. It felt less like the gaze of an invalid and more like that of a teacher studying a slow, uncertain pupil. She was the one who was meant to be the caretaker. Yet she felt increasingly like a stranger adrift in a world whose rules she did not understand, a world that Tuhalan inhabited as easily as a fish in water. Her loneliness was a physical thing, a hollow space inside her that the desert wind seemed to blow right through. She was performing a job, a series of tasks to earn her keep, yet a feeling began to grow within her, a sense of foreboding and destiny all at once. It was a current running deep beneath the surface of the silent days. One evening, as she sat mending a tear in her skirt by the light of a flickering candle, the thought arrived, fully formed, as if carried to her on the night air. It settled in her mind with the weight of absolute truth, a premonition that was both terrifying and profound. Caring for an 80-year-old Apache was just a job, until what happened changed my life forever. The transition from one day to the next was as seamless and subtle as the changing hues of the desert sky. Weeks melted into a month, and the sharp edges of Abigail's fear began to soften. Worn down by the quiet rhythm of their existence, the desert, which had first seemed an enemy, was becoming a stern but honest teacher. Her hands, once soft and suited to needlepoint, were now calloused and capable. She learned that the sun was not only a tyrant but also a clock, a guide, and a purifier. The silence of the cabin was no longer an emptiness to be filled, but a space in which to listen. Her education began not with words, but with gestures. One morning, as she struggled to light a fire with the dry, stubborn mesquite wood, Tulin rose from his chair. He walked past her and returned with a chunk of charcoal from a previous fire. He crushed it into a fine powder, laid it at the base of the new wood, and with a single spark from the flint, a steady flame was born. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a flicker of something that was not quite a smile, but was no longer the flat, hard gaze of their first meeting. It was the first lesson the land provides, and what it has given once, it can give again. Survival here was a different language than the one she knew. Back in Kansas, survival meant protecting crops from hail and praying the winter was not too harsh. Here, it was a daily, intimate negotiation with death. A rattlesnake, coiled in the shade near the well, sent a jolt of pure terror through her. Her scream was swallowed by the immense landscape, but Tulin was there in an instant, moving with a speed that belied his age. There was no panic in his movements, only a swift, economical efficiency. With a long, forked stick, he pinned the creature's head, and the life went out of it. Abigail's revulsion was a sour taste in her mouth. She expected him to fling the carcass away, but instead, he handled it with a strange reverence, carefully drawing out the venom and then skinning the snake with a shard of obsidian. Later, she watched, horrified and fascinated, as he mixed a part of the creature into a poultice, which he applied to his own swollen, arthritic knuckles. The next day, the swelling was gone. It was a medicine more potent than anything Dr. Miller kept in his black bag. He began to speak, though his words were like stones dropped into a deep well, infrequent and resonant. He would point to the sky and say, "Wind comes from the thirsty mountain." It was not a prediction, but a statement of fact. He was teaching her to read the subtle shifts in the air, the way the dust danced on the horizon, the particular shade of yellow that foretold a coming sandstorm. He taught her to listen to the sand itself, to the sigh it made as it settled in the evening, a sound that meant the cool of the night would be deep and restorative. She learned which plants held water, which roots could be eaten, and which leaves, when crushed, could soothe an insect bite. These were not jobs anymore. They were lessons in living. Through this slow, careful unfolding, pieces of his past emerged. They were never offered as a story, but as brief, stark fragments. One afternoon, watching a hawk circle high above, he spoke without looking at her. "My son watched the sky like that." The words hung in the still, hot air. Another time, as she kneaded dough for their meal, he touched the flour sack gently. "My woman made bread." She sang a song. He did not say more, and Abigail knew not to ask. The silence that followed these pronouncements was sacred, filled with the ghosts of a life she could barely imagine. He mentioned the long walk only once. He used the English words, and his voice was a low, rough whisper, as if the phrase itself was a wound. "They made us walk, the blue coats, walk until the old ones and the babies fell in the snow. Walk away from our land." He looked out the window then, but she knew he was not seeing the sun-baked desert before them. He was seeing a different landscape, one of memory and snow and unbearable loss. A war was being fought inside Abigail's own heart. Every instinct, every lesson from her own people, had taught her to fear this man's kind. The newspapers and the pulp novels were filled with tales of their savagery, their godless ways. She had been raised to believe they were a people without souls, an obstacle to progress. Yet the man before her was none of those things. He was a teacher. He was a grieving father and a husband. He possessed a quiet dignity that shamed the loud, boastful men of Dustwater. She felt a growing compassion for him. an empathy that was as frightening as it was undeniable. This feeling wrestled with a deeply ingrained prejudice, leaving her in a constant state of turmoil. She would watch his gnarled hands and remember the gentle way he showed her how to use the charcoal. And then she would be seized by a cold wave of guilt for the thoughts she had been taught to harbor. She was caring for a man, not a monster, and this simple truth was rearranging the entire world as she knew it. The peak of her internal conflict, the moment that finally tipped the scales, came on a moonless night. She was awakened by a strange, flickering light against her wall. Puzzled, she slipped from her cot and crept to the window. Outside, in a small clearing behind the cabin, Tualan had built a small, clean fire. He was not sitting by it for warmth. He was standing before it, his silhouette dark against the dancing flames. A low, rhythmic sound reached her ears. He was chanting, a sound that was not a song but a prayer, a lament. It was a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Ancient and filled with a sorrow so profound, it made Abigail's own losses feel small and pale. He moved slowly, his feet tracing patterns in the sand. He raised his hands to the star-dusted sky, then brought them down to touch the ground. He was speaking to the fire, to the night, to the spirits of the land and the ghosts of his memory. Abigail watched, hidden in the shadows, feeling like an intruder on a ceremony of immense and private significance. The firelight illuminated his face, and she saw what no one else was meant to see. Tears were carving clean paths through the dust and wrinkles on his cheeks. They glistened like diamonds in the fire's glow. In that moment, every caricature, every whispered story of the savage Indian crumbled to dust. She was not witnessing a heathen ritual. She was witnessing an act of pure, heartbreaking faith. She was watching a man commune with his God and his grief, mourning his family, his people, his lost world, with a devotion that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. She backed away from the window, her own eyes blurred with tears, and returned to her bed, her body trembling. The world was not as simple as she had been told. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it was a strange, troubled slumber. She found herself walking not in the desert she knew, but in a version of it from a dream, where the saguaros cast long, thin shadows that seemed to whisper to one another. The wind began to rise, not with the familiar hot breath of the day, but with a cool, gentle touch, and on the wind, clear as a bell, she heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, speaking in a tongue she did not understand, but in the heart of the melodic words, she heard her own name, called out with a soft, persistent yearning. Abigail. The sound was so real, so close, that she sat bolt upright in her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was silent. The fire outside had died down to embers, but the voice lingered in her ears, a haunting echo in the vast, listening silence of the desert night. The voice from the dream clung to Abigail like the morning chill, a ghost of a sound that the bright, hard sunlight could not entirely banish. The day that followed was unnaturally still. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down with a suffocating weight that made each breath feel earned. Even the lizards seemed to have vanished, seeking refuge from a threat Abigail could not see but could feel in her bones. By midday, the sky, usually a brilliant, endless blue, had taken on a sickly yellow tint, the color of a fading bruise. Tualan had not spoken all morning. He sat by the door, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, which were slowly being erased by a haze of dust. There was a tension in his stillness that Abigail had never seen before. He was like an old animal sensing the approach of a predator, every fiber of his being attuned to the coming danger. He finally turned his head and looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly, the sound of stones grinding together. "Big water comes," he said. It was not a prediction, it was a verdict. The first gust of wind struck the cabin like a physical blow, rattling the single window in its frame and sending a shower of dust down from the rafters. The world outside vanished in an instant. consumed by a swirling wall of red sand. The sun was gone, the sky was gone, and there was only the roar. It was a sound beyond hearing, a physical vibration that shook the small cabin to its foundations. It was the sound of the world being torn apart, working together without a word. They forced the heavy wooden bar across the door. Abigail stuffed rags into the cracks around the window frame, but the fine, stinging sand still found its way inside, coating everything in a gritty film. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a flimsy wooden box tossed on a violent sea. The wind shrieked and howled, clawing at the walls, seeking a way in. Each gust was accompanied by the crack and thud of debris striking the roof. Hours passed in a twilight of dust and noise. The roar of the wind was joined by a new sound, a deep, percussive drumming that grew steadily louder. Rain. Not the gentle, life-giving rain of Kansas, but a furious, driving deluge that hammered the roof with the force of thrown rocks. Water began to seep under the door and drip from the ceiling. A dark stain spread across the wooden planks above them. Then came the lightning. A flash of incandescent white turned the dusty interior of the cabin into a stark, terrifying tableau for a split second, followed by a crack of thunder so immediate and violent that the very air seemed to split open. Abigail cried out, pressing her hands to her ears. In the ringing silence that followed, she heard a new sound, a groan of stressed wood from above. She looked up in time to see one of the heavy roof beams, sodden with water and weakened by the storm's assault. Splinter and break free, it happened with a terrible slowness. The beam sagged, then dropped, swinging down like a pendulum. Tuholan was directly in its path. Abigail screamed his name, a wordless shriek of warning, but he was too old, too slow. He turned, his eyes wide, as the heavy timber struck him across the shoulder and chest, throwing him to the floor with a sickening thud. The storm outside ceased to exist. Abigail's world narrowed to the still form of the old man on the packed earth floor. She scrambled to his side, her hands fluttering over him, not knowing where to touch. A dark gash was open on his temple, and his arm was bent at an unnatural angle. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Another groan from the roof above told her they could not stay. The entire structure was threatening to collapse. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but something else rose to meet it. A fierce, protective instinct she did not know she possessed. He was not her employer, not an Apache, not a stranger. He was a life, a fragile flame she had to keep from being extinguished. She grabbed a blanket, tearing it into strips with her teeth and hands, and bound his arm as tightly as she could. Then, with a strength born of pure desperation, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag him toward the door. Getting the door open was a battle in itself. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her grasp, while the rain and mud created a sucking seal at the bottom. She put her entire weight into it, and with a scream of effort, forced it open just enough to squeeze through, dragging Tuholan behind her. The world she emerged into was a nightmare of wind, water, and chaos. The dry wash that ran 100 yards from the cabin was now a churning, muddy river. A torrent of brown water filled with uprooted brush and debris. Their only hope for shelter was a small cluster of rock formations on the other side. There was no choice. She half carried, half dragged the old man's limp body toward the flood. The water was shockingly cold, and the current was a living thing, pulling and tearing at her legs, trying to drag them both under. The riverbed was a treacherous mess of mud and unseen rocks. She stumbled, went to her knees, the muddy water rising to her chest. Tuholan's dead weight was an anchor, pulling her down. She held his head above the water, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning. For a moment, she thought they were lost, but then she saw his face, pale and still in the storm's gloom, and found a new reserve of strength. She would not let this land take him. She made it to the other side, collapsing in the mud, gasping for air. She dragged him the last few feet to a shallow overhang of rock that offered minimal protection from the driving rain. He was shivering violently now, his skin icy to the touch. The wet blanket offered no warmth. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, that if she could not get him warm, he would die. There was no wood for a fire, nothing dry to burn. There was only the wind, the cold rain, and the shivering, broken man beside her. Her mind, frantic, latched onto a memory, a story her father had told of soldiers caught in a blizzard, of how they survived the killing cold. It was a desperate, primal act, but it was all she had left. With trembling hands, she lay down on the cold, wet ground beside him. She untied his wet blanket and wrapped her own arms and legs around his frail, trembling body, pressing herself against him, trying to force the warmth from her own living flesh into his. It was an act of profound, terrifying intimacy, not of passion, but of sheer, desperate humanity. She was a shield, a furnace, a last defense against the cold hand of death. She held him tight, her face buried in his damp hair, and felt his shivering slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to subside. The grit of sand was on her lips. Her tears were indistinguishable from the rain, and in the heart of the raging storm, she held on, praying to a God she was no longer sure she understood. Dawn broke with a startling gentleness. The wind had died, the rain had stopped, and a pale, watery light filtered through the clouds. The world was washed clean, but it was a world transformed. The desert was a wreck of mud and broken things. Abigail, stiff and cold, slowly sat up. Tuhalin was breathing steadily, his eyes still closed, but the deathly chill was gone from his skin. She helped him back to the cabin, or what was left of it. One wall had collapsed entirely, and the roof had caved in. It was a ruin. Everything they owned was soaked and buried in mud. They stood there for a long time, surveying the devastation. Abigail felt an exhaustion so deep it went past muscle and bone, all the way to her soul. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange and unfamiliar peace. She had been tested to her absolute limit and had survived. The war inside her was over. Tuhalan leaned heavily against her, his gaze taking in the wreckage. He then turned his head and looked at her. His dark eyes were clear, and for the first time, she saw not just a survivor, but a man who saw her, truly saw her. His voice was weak, but the words were steady and clear. "You have listened to the land," he said. "Now it listens to you." The days that followed the storm were a quiet testament to endurance. The sun returned with a gentle, almost apologetic warmth, and the air was washed clean of dust, together. Abigail and Tuhalin worked to reclaim their small space from the chaos. The cabin was beyond repair, but they salvaged timbers to build a lean-to against the most stable remaining wall, creating a three-sided shelter that was open to the desert. It was a humble dwelling, more a camp than a home, but it was theirs, rebuilt with a shared purpose that needed no words. Tuhalan's injuries were healing slowly. His shoulder was a map of deep purple bruises, and he moved with a stiff, pained deliberation. He could no longer do the heavy work, but he directed Abigail with a quiet authority, showing her how to lash the timbers together with strips of yucca fiber, how to patch the roof with mud and reeds to keep out the worst of the sun. In this slow, quiet labor, the last walls between them seemed to dissolve. He was no longer her charge, and she was no longer his caretaker. They were partners in the simple, desperate business of living. One afternoon, while clearing the last of the storm's debris from a patch of earth where Tuhalan had grown a few hardy plants, Abigail's shovel struck something hard and flat. It was not the familiar clink of rock, but a dull, solid thud, curious. She cleared away the mud and found a large, smooth flagstone, perfectly fitted against the base of a rock outcropping. It looked natural, yet there was an intentionality to its placement that caught her attention. A small, carved symbol at its edge. A spiral matched one on the cabin's old door frame. Driven by an instinct she did not understand, She wedged the tip of the shovel under the stone's edge and heaved. It resisted, then shifted with a grating sound, revealing a dark, cool space beneath. She peered into the opening. It was a small, natural hollow in the rock, dry and shielded from the elements. Something was inside, wrapped in layers of old, soft buckskin. She felt a prickle of apprehension, a sense that she was trespassing on sacred ground. She looked over at Tuhalan, who was watching her from his seat by the fire. He had seen the whole thing. Their eyes met across the short distance, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not just permission, it was an invitation. With a deep breath, Abigail reached into the cool darkness and carefully lifted the bundle. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it into the sunlight and set it down, her hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped the layers of worn leather. The contents stole her breath. The first was a bracelet, forged from heavy, dark silver. It was not the shiny, polished silver from a town jeweler, but something ancient and elemental. Intricate patterns were hammered into its surface, images of suns and eagles and the winding path of a river. She recognized its artistry, its power. Beside it lay several small, folded pieces of deerskin, tanned to the color of cream. She unfolded one. On it, painted in natural pigments of red ochre and charcoal, was the image of a man and a woman standing beside a saguaro cactus. Their hands joined. Another showed the woman holding a small child. They were simple, almost childlike drawings, yet they conveyed a world of love and connection. But it was the last object that made her heart stop. It was a small portrait, a detailed sketch in charcoal on a flat, smooth piece of wood. It depicted a woman, young and arrestingly beautiful. Her hair was dark and worn in 2 long braids like an Apache woman, but her eyes were a startling shade of light gray, and her features held a softness that spoke of a different heritage. She was a woman caught between 2 worlds. She looked out from the sketch not with a smile, but with a gaze of serene strength and profound gentleness. Abigail looked from the face in the portrait to the old man by the fire. A deep, impossible truth began to dawn on her. She gathered the treasures carefully and walked over to him, kneeling in the sand and holding out the piece of wood. Tuhalan did not take it. He simply looked down at the face of the woman, and the years seemed to fall away from his own. The stoic mask he wore against the world dissolved, revealing a grief that was as raw and deep as a fresh wound. "Mary Lou," he whispered, the name a soft, aching sound, a prayer he had kept locked in his heart for half a century. He told her the story then, not all at once, but in pieces, his voice rough with disuse and memory. Mary Lou had been his wife. Her father had been an Irish trader who had loved an Apache woman. Mary Lou had walked in both worlds, belonging fully to neither, but she had chosen to make her life with Tuhalan, in the world of her mother's people. The deerskin paintings were her stories of their life together, of the birth of their son. His voice faltered when he spoke of the end. It had not been a battle, but a slaughter. Blue-coated soldiers, sweeping through the territory, clearing the land. They had come to the village at dawn. There was fire and screaming. Mary Lou had been running, their small son in her arms. When a soldier on horseback had ridden her down, she had shielded the boy's body with her own. The soldier had not stopped. Tuhalan's eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, seeing the horror of that day as if it were yesterday. "She died on the land that gave her life," he said, his voice hollow. "My son followed her to the spirit world a season later, his heart broken." He paused, taking a long, ragged breath. "I made a promise to her spirit. I would stay. I would keep her memory here, in this soil. This is not just my home. It is their grave. It is the only thing the world has left of them." Abigail's throat was tight with unshed tears. The story settled in her heart, a terrible weight of historical sin and personal tragedy. She finally understood the carvings, the silence, the profound sorrow in his eyes. He was not just living. He was standing guard over a legacy, a love story the world had tried to erase. The fragile peace of this new understanding was shattered a few weeks later. With their shelter stable and their supplies dwindling, Abigail knew she had to make the journey to Dustwater. She left at dawn, promising to return by nightfall. The town felt different. A nervous, greedy energy hummed in the air. In the general store, 3 men stood by the counter, their voices loud and coarse. They were strangers, dressed in dusty trail clothes, with pistols holstered low on their hips and a swagger that spoke of easy violence. They were talking about gold. "Heard the old-timer out by the rocks is sitting on a whole mess of it." One of them said, "A man with a scarred face and mean little eyes. An old Apache shaman. They always buried their silver and their magic charms with them." "Is that so?" the storekeeper asked, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Sure it is," the second man chimed in. He was younger, with a cruel twist to his mouth. The army cleared most of them out, but some of the old ones hid their treasures. "We reckon we will pay him a visit, see if he wants to share." They all laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Abigail felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her hand froze above a sack of flour. They were talking about Tuolin, the sacred objects she had held in her hands. They saw only as loot. She kept her head down, quickly gathered the beans and salt she needed, paid the storekeeper, and left without a word, feeling the men's eyes on her back. The ride back to the camp was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Her loyalty to Tuolin was a fierce, protective fire in her chest. He had trusted her with the most precious part of himself, but her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Those men were dangerous. She was a woman, alone. To protect him would be to stand against them, an act that could easily get her killed. To do nothing felt like a betrayal so profound it would poison the rest of her life. The desert, which had taught her about survival against the elements, now presented her with a far more terrifying challenge: survival against the greed and cruelty of men. She arrived back at the shelter as the sun was setting, the sky bleeding red and orange. She looked at the old man, the guardian of a sacred memory, and knew that the storm had not been the last of their trials. A far worse one was coming, riding on the heels of a greedy rumor. Abigail did not try to soften the truth. She returned from Dustwater as the sun bled across the horizon, and in the strange, theatrical light of the dying day, she told Tuolin what she had heard. She spoke in a low, steady voice, relaying the ugly talk of gold and sacred things, of the greedy light she had seen in the men's eyes. She expected him to show fear, or anger, or perhaps a weary resignation. He showed none of it. He listened, his ancient face as still and unreadable as the desert rock. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the deepening twilight. Finally, he nodded once, a slow, heavy gesture. "It is the same hunger," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "It is the hunger that eats the world." There was nothing left to say. They ate their simple meal of corn cakes and beans in silence as the last of the light fled and a vast, star-filled darkness settled over the land. The night was alive with its usual sounds: the chirp of crickets, the distant call of a coyote. But tonight each sound was sharp and freighted with menace. Every rustle of a leaf, every shift of the wind, made Abigail's heart leap into her throat. She felt exposed, fragile, a tiny island of warmth and light in a vast, predatory darkness. Tuolin showed no such fear. He moved with a quiet purpose. Going to the hollow beneath the flagstone, he brought out the buckskin bundle and, by the low light of their small fire, he unwrapped it. He did not look at the objects but handled them with a familiar reverence, his gnarled fingers tracing the patterns on the silver bracelet, gently folding the painted deerskins. He was not preparing for a fight. He was communing with his memories, drawing strength from the love that still lived in these few precious things. He carefully rewrapped the bundle and placed it back in its hiding place, covering it once more with the stone. He had secured the memory. Now he would guard the ground where it lay. They did not have to wait long. The sound came first, not from the direction of the town, but from the darkness behind them. The snap of a twig, too loud to be an animal. Then voices, low and ugly. Abigail's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron skillet by the fire, the only weapon she had. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, their forms indistinct until they stepped into the edge of the firelight. It was the men from the store. The scarred man was in the lead, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He held a rifle loosely in one hand. The younger one and his companion fanned out, their expressions a mixture of greed and menace. "Evening, ma'am," the scarred man said, his voice oozing a false politeness. "We came to talk to the old man about some property." "He has nothing for you," Abigail said, her own voice tight but surprisingly firm. She stood directly between them and Tuhalan, who had risen slowly to his feet but remained by the fire, a still, dignified silhouette against the flames. "Now, that ain't for you to say," the younger man sneered. "We know he's got things hidden, old Indian treasure. We just want our share." "This is his home. There is no treasure. You need to leave," Abigail insisted, her knuckles white where she gripped the skillet. The scarred man's smile vanished. "We ain't asking." He took a step forward, and Abigail held her ground. For a moment, a tense standoff held them all in its grip. The fire crackled, casting their shadows long and dancing against the rocks. Then, with a sudden, vicious movement, the third man lunged from the side, not at Abigail, but at their shelter. He held a burning torch he had lit from the fire. With a grunt of effort, he thrust it deep into the dry timber and thatch of the lean-to. The structure caught fire with a hungry roar. Dry wood, baked by 100 years of sun, went up in an instant. Flames leaped toward the night sky, devouring their humble home, casting a terrible, flickering light over the scene. The attack had begun. In the chaos of smoke and heat, Abigail's mind was a point of cold clarity. She grabbed Tualan's arm. The hollow. She choked out, her voice raw from the smoke. "We have to go." He did not resist. He let her guide him away from the inferno, around the rock outcropping, toward the one place of safety. The shouts of the men followed them, but they were momentarily distracted by the blaze they had created, searching the ruins for a strongbox or a hidden floorboard that did not exist. That small distraction was all the time Abigail and Tuhalan needed. She pulled the heavy flagstone aside, and they slipped into the cool, dark earth, pulling the stone back into place over their heads. They huddled together in the tight, silent darkness. Above them, they could hear the crackle of the fire and the angry, frustrated shouts of the men as they realized their prize was not in the ashes. The air in the hollow was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone. It was a tomb, a womb, a sanctuary. Outside, their world was burning. Tuhalan's breathing was shallow beside her. He fumbled in the darkness, his hand finding hers. He pressed something cold and heavy into her palm, the silver bracelet. "They will find this place," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise from above. "I must lead them away." "No," Abigail pleaded, her voice breaking. "Stay here. They will leave when they find nothing." "This kind of hunger does not leave," he answered, his voice firm with a terrible finality. He closed her fingers over the bracelet. "If I die, remember, the land keeps what it loves." Before she could protest further, he pushed against the stone. It scraped open, letting in a sliver of hellish, orange light. He squeezed her hand one last time, a gesture of thanks, of blessing, of farewell. Then he was gone, a fleeting shadow against the fire, before he pulled the stone shut, plunging her back into absolute darkness. She was alone, trapped with the pounding of her own heart. She heard a noise, a deliberate crash, from the far side of the clearing. His diversion. The men shouted, their voices filled with renewed excitement. "Over there, he's getting away." Their footsteps pounded the earth, moving away from her hiding place. Abigail pressed her face against the cold stone, her body rigid, every muscle screaming for her to follow, to help, to do something, But his last, unspoken command held her fast. Stay hidden. Protect the memory. She heard them crashing through the brush, shouting at one another. Then came the sound, a single sharp crack that split the night, louder than the fire, more final than the thunder. After the shot, there was silence. It was a silence more terrifying than all the noise that had come before. A heavy, profound silence that swallowed the crackle of the dying fire and the last of the men's voices as they presumably inspected their work. She did not know how long she waited in that suffocating darkness, listening. She heard the men move off, their horses fading into the distance. She waited longer, until the last glow of the fire through the crack in the stone faded to nothing. She waited until the cold of the deep night seeped into her bones. She waited until the blackness outside began to soften into the first pale gray of dawn. When she finally pushed the stone away and climbed out, the world was a study in ashes and grief. The lean-to was a pile of blackened, smoking timbers. The air smelled of char and loss. The desert was quiet, a silent, sorrowful witness. She found him at the edge of the clearing, where he had fallen, leading the hunters away. He lay on his back, his face turned toward the eastern sky, which was just beginning to blush with the promise of a new day. There was no pain on his face, only a profound and final peace. He had fallen on his own land, a guardian to the very end. Abigail knelt beside him, the cold silver bracelet on her wrist a brand of her new and terrible inheritance. The tears she had held back all night finally came, a silent, scalding torrent. She wept for him, for his lost wife and son, for a world that could produce such goodness and such cruelty all at once. But she did not weep for long. Grief was a luxury, and there was work to be done. He could not be left for the scavengers. He had to be returned to the land that he loved, the land that would now keep him. With her bare hands and a sharpened piece of burnt timber, she began to dig. In the soft, sandy soil near the hollow, she carved a shallow grave from the earth. The work was brutal, her muscles screaming, her hands raw and bleeding. But with every scoop of earth, she felt she was performing a sacred rite, the last act of care she could ever give him. She worked through the sunrise, the sky turning from soft pink to brilliant gold. When the grave was ready, she gently laid him to rest, folding his hands over his chest. She filled the grave, stone by stone, handful by handful, until he was once again part of the desert. On top of the small mound, she placed a smooth, flat stone, one of the stones on which he had carved the symbol of the sun. It was his only headstone, a final, silent word in the language he had taught her. She stood, swaying with exhaustion, as the first rays of the new sun touched the fresh earth of his grave. A lone woman in a landscape of ashes, forever changed. The first day was a void. Abigail moved through it like a ghost in her own life, her body a machine performing the tasks of survival while her spirit remained kneeling in the dirt beside a mound of fresh earth. She fetched water. She found a few scorched handfuls of beans in a split sack and ate them cold. Without tasting them, the sun beat down, and the ashes of her home cooled around her, and she felt nothing. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. It was the silence of a world that had ended. Days bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of shadows across the ravaged clearing. She did not sleep. Not truly. She would collapse from an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone, only to drift in a gray, restless twilight, haunted by the crack of the rifle shot and the sight of a still face turned toward the dawn. The heavy silver bracelet on her wrist was a constant presence, its cold weight a perpetual reminder of a hand she could no longer hold, a promise she did not know how to keep. She began to feel she was not alone. It started subtly, a trick of the senses in the vast, empty landscape. A gust of wind would move through the skeletal remains of a mesquite tree, and for a moment it would sound like a low, drawn-out sigh. She would turn, her heart lurching, expecting to see him sitting by the ashes of the fire, but there was only the wind and the empty space, The scuff of a lizard on the sand would mimic the soft sound of his moccasins, and the call of a distant bird would hold a note of his chanting. At first, she dismissed it as grief, a mind unmoored by trauma, creating echoes to fill the unbearable emptiness. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger. The land no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. He had told her the land now listened to her, and she began to feel it was also speaking. She would find herself talking aloud, her voice a rough, strange sound in the silence. "The well is getting low," she would murmur, as if he were there to hear her. "I think another storm is coming from the mountains." She was not losing her mind. She was learning a new way to listen, a new way to be. His presence was not in the air, but in the earth itself, in the heat shimmering off the rocks, in the ancient, patient gaze of the saguaros. He was all around her. One evening, as she sat on the ground, the silver bracelet cool against her skin, she began to truly look at it for the first time since he had given it to her. She had been aware only of its weight, its meaning as a final gift. Now, her fingers traced the intricate, hammered patterns, the eagles, the suns, the winding river. It was a story in silver, as she turned it over and over, feeling the texture of the deep grooves. Her thumb caught on a small irregularity, one of the hammered sun symbols, no larger than her fingernail, seemed to have a faint line around it, a seam so perfectly integrated into the design it was almost invisible. Her curiosity stirred, a faint flicker of life in the numb landscape of her grief. She tried to pry at it with her nail, but it would not budge. She picked up a sharp sliver of rock and carefully inserted the tip into the hairline crack. With a gentle pressure, she worked it back and forth. There was a tiny click, and the silver sun popped open on a minuscule, hidden hinge. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside, nestled in a small, hollowed-out compartment, was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of deerskin. It was no bigger than the first joint of her little finger. With trembling hands, she carefully worked it free. The deerskin was old, incredibly soft and fragile. She unrolled it slowly, terrified it would crumble to dust. Words were written on it, not in the painted symbols of the Apache, but in a neat, faded script of English, written with ink that had turned a soft brown with age. The hand was delicate, feminine. It was Mary Lou's hand. There was only one sentence, a single line that held the weight of a lifetime. "The heart remembers what the world forgets." Abigail read the words again and again. They were not an epitaph. They were a testament, a mission statement. They were the secret key to Tulin's entire existence, the reason he had endured the loneliness, the camps, the loss of everything. The world had forgotten Mary Lou and their son. The world had forgotten his people's songs, their gods, their names, but his heart had remembered. He had stood guard over that memory, a lone warrior fighting not with a rifle, but with the simple, unbreakable power of remembrance. And with his last act, he had passed that duty, that sacred trust, to her. A profound shift occurred within her, a settling of the turmoil that had churned in her soul since the night of the fire. The exhaustion was still there. The grief was a permanent ache in her chest, but the aimless despair was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. She was the heart that had to remember now, but memory was a fragile thing. It could fade like ink, crumble like old leather. A whisper on the wind was not enough. The story had to be given a form that could endure. She went to the ruin of her own past, to the single valise she had carried from Kansas. It had been in the lean-to, and was charred and soaked from the fire and the water she had used to douse the last of the embers. She tore it open. Most of the contents were a ruined mess. Her spare dress was a blackened rag, but at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was the small, plain journal her husband had given her and a single pencil. The oilcloth had protected them. The pages were dry. She carried the journal back to the spot where she had buried him. She sat on the ground, the book open on her lap, the silver bracelet on her wrist. The sun was warm on her back. The desert was quiet. listening. She looked at the blank page, a vast, empty landscape waiting for a story. Where to begin how to capture the truth of a man like Tuolin, the beauty of a love like his and Mary Lou's, the ugliness of the hatred that had destroyed them. She thought of his silence, his lessons, his dignity. She thought of his face illuminated by the fire of his ceremony, the tears carving paths through the dust. The world knew the Apache only as savages, as obstacles. She knew a man who had taught her how to read the wind and how to survive a storm. She knew a heart that had remembered when the world forgot. She put the pencil to the paper. The first words came. Simple and true, a foundation stone for the monument she would build for him. His name was Tuolin. He was an Apache, and this is his story. The journal was filled. Every page was a testament, a headstone, a protest against the silence of the desert. Abigail wrote until the pencil was a small, useless stub, and her fingers were cramped and stiff. She poured onto the pages the color of the sunset, the sound of the wind, the texture of a carved stone, the weight of a man's grief. She wrote of the lessons, the storm, the fire, and the final, terrible gunshot. When she wrote the last word, a profound quiet settled over her. The story was safe now, captured in ink and paper, a tangible piece of a life that had been returned to the earth. Her vigil was over. A new duty was beginning. She knew she could not stay. This patch of earth was a sacred place, a place of memory and transformation. But it was not a place to live. It was a grave and a crucible. To remain would be to root herself in grief. And the legacy Tuolin had given her was not about endings, but about continuation. It was a seed, and it needed to be planted in living soil. The morning she left, the air was cool and clear. She stood for a long time before the small mound of earth, the sunstone a dark shape in the pale light. She touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, its metal cool against her skin. It felt like a part of her now, its weight as familiar as the beat of her own heart. She did not say goodbye. Words were inadequate. Instead, she made a silent promise, a vow spoken from her heart to the ground beneath her feet. I will remember. I will not let the world forget. She took almost nothing. The charred valise was left behind, a final shedding of her old life. She carried only a small bundle with the journal, a water skin, and the last of the beans. She turned her back on the ruin and began the long walk to Dustwater. The journey was different this time. She did not see an empty, hostile wasteland. She saw the land that had taught her, that had tested her, that had reshaped her soul. She read the stories in the clouds, felt the subtle language of the wind, and moved with a new and quiet confidence. The fear was gone, burned away in the fire and washed clean by the storm. She was no longer a frightened widow from Kansas. She was a woman carrying a legacy, and she walked with the purpose of a pilgrim. When she reached Dustwater, the town seemed smaller, uglier, more fragile than she remembered. Its loud, false bravado was a flimsy defense against the immense, ancient silence that surrounded it. She ignored the curious stares and walked directly to the office of Dr. Miller. He looked up from his desk, his weary face registering surprise, then a flicker of pity. "Abigail," he said, rising, "I heard about the fire, a terrible business. I am so sorry." "It was not a fire," Abigail said. Her voice clear and steady, she stood straight, her gaze unwavering. "It was a raid. 3 men came. They were looking for treasure. They burned the shelter and they ended his life." The doctor paled. He sat down heavily. The men who were in the store, he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I heard they left town the next day, bragging about running off the old man." "They were liars and thieves," Abigail said, her voice devoid of heat, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact. Tuolin died defending his home, defending the memory of his wife and son. Dr. Miller stared at her, at the soot on her clothes, the new lines etched around her eyes, the calm, unyielding strength in her posture. He saw before him not the desperate woman who had taken the job, but a stranger. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. "I am leaving," she said. "But there is something you should know. The money that was sent for his care, where did it come from?" He hesitated, then sighed. "A church group back east. They send funds for what they call the civilizing of the native population." A bitter smile touched Abigail's lips. "He was more civilized than any man in this town," she said. "I cannot take their money. Send it back. Tell them the job is finished." She turned to leave. "Wait," the doctor called after her. "What about you? You have nothing—" Abigail paused at the door and held up her arm, letting the silver bracelet catch the light. "You are wrong," she said. "I have everything I need." And with that, she walked out into the dusty street and did not look back. The years that followed were a journey. Abigail traveled not toward any particular destination, but away from the world of hungry, greedy men. She worked in dusty railroad towns and remote ranching outposts, taking any job she could find. She was a cook, a laundress, a mender of clothes. She spoke little of her past, a quiet, solitary woman who kept to herself. But every night, by the light of a cheap candle or a lonely campfire, she would read from her journal, keeping the story alive, keeping Tuhalin's voice and Mary Lou's memory from fading into the silence. She saved every spare penny, hoarding it not for a comfortable future, but for a purpose that was slowly taking shape in her mind. She finally found her place on the borderlands of the territory, in a small, forgotten settlement that was little more than a collection of adobe huts and a single trading post. It was a place where worlds collided and blended, where Mexican farmers, white traders, and the scattered remnants of Apache families lived in a state of uneasy truce. It was a place of in-between people, and especially in-between children. Children with skin the color of honey and eyes of every shade from prairie sky blue to the dark of a desert night. Children who carried two histories in their blood, and were often shunned by both. It was here that Abigail used the money she had saved to buy a small, crumbling adobe structure. With her own hands, she repaired the walls, patched the roof, and built rough wooden benches. It was not much, but it was a start. She opened a school. Her first students were wary, shy children who had been told their Apache blood was a thing of shame. She did not begin with letters or numbers. She began with stories. She told them the stories Tuhalin had told her, stories of the wind and the stars, of the coyote and the eagle. She taught them the names of the desert plants in the Apache tongue, words that were a song on the lips. She showed them the beautiful silver bracelet, and told them of the woman who had drawn the pictures on deerskin, a woman who, like them, had a heart that lived in two worlds. Only after she had given them back a piece of the heritage that had been stolen from them did she teach them to read and write in English. She taught them that a person could hold two languages in their head, two histories in their heart, without one diminishing the other. Her small school became a sanctuary, a place of reconciliation. It was an act of atonement, not for her own sins, but for the sins of her people. She was rebuilding, in some small way, the world that men like the treasure hunters had tried to burn to the ground. One night, after a long day of teaching, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. In the dream, she was standing once again in the desert clearing, but it was not a ruin. It was whole and untouched, as if the storm and the fire had never happened. The air was clean and sweet with the scent of sage. She was not alone. Tuhalin was standing in the distance, not as the frail, 80-year-old man she had known, but as a man in the prime of his life, tall and strong. He was not looking at her, but at something behind her. She turned and saw Mary Lou standing beside him, her hand in his, and a small boy at their side. They were a family, complete and unbroken. Tuhalin turned his head and looked at her. He did not speak, but he smiled. It was a smile of gratitude, of peace, of a promise fulfilled. Abigail woke up with the soft light of dawn filling her small room. The dream was as vivid as any memory. She touched the silver bracelet on her wrist. The desert had held the memory of Tuhalin's family. The storm had been a brutal baptism, cleansing her of her old life and forging her into a vessel for his legacy. And the bracelet was the unbroken circle, the link between their world and the new one she was building. One child, one story at a time. His legacy was safe. It was alive. The young man from the east sat across the simple wooden table, his notebook filled with a hurried, earnest script. Outside the open door of the small adobe schoolhouse, the Arizona sun was making its final, glorious descent, painting the dusty landscape in strokes of deep orange and soft violet. 20 years had passed. The world had charged headlong into a new century of machines and noise. But here, in this quiet corner of the territory, time moved at the pace of a shadow stretching across the desert floor. The journalist, whose name was Davies, looked at the woman before him. Abigail Monroe was old now. Her hair was the color of snow, and her face was a beautiful, intricate map of her life, every line earned by sun and sorrow and laughter. Her hands, resting on the table, were gnarled and work-worn, but they moved with a gentle grace. On one wrist, worn smooth by the passage of 2 decades, was a heavy silver bracelet. It seemed less an ornament and more a part of her, like bone and sinew. "It is an incredible story, Mrs. Monroe," Davies said, his voice soft with a sincerity that went beyond his profession. He gestured with his pen toward the small, tidy schoolroom behind them. "To have built all this, to have given a home and a history to so many children who had neither. It is a true legacy." He paused, searching for his final question, the one that would tie the whole narrative together for his readers back in a world of brick buildings and paved streets. "I suppose what I am still trying to understand," he said, leaning forward slightly, "is the beginning. What brought a woman like you, a widow from Kansas, to a place like this, to this life?" Abigail did not answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the place where the fiery sun met the bruised purple of the distant mountains. The sounds of evening drifted in through the doorway, the gentle murmur of her students playing in the dusk, their voices a mix of English and the soft, melodic cadence of the Apache tongue she had painstakingly learned and passed on. Her school was not just a place of letters and numbers. It was a sanctuary of memory, a place where no child was made to feel that a part of their own heart was a thing to be forgotten. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, weathered like old wood, but as clear as the desert air after a storm. "You ask what brought me here," she said, her eyes still on the dying light. "You see a school, a legacy, but it did not begin with a grand idea. It did not begin with a plan. In truth, it began with an empty stomach and a future that was as blank and unforgiving as that desert out there." She turned her gaze from the window and looked at the young journalist, but her eyes were seeing a different time, a different place. "I was a young woman then, full of the foolish certainties and silent prejudices of my people. I was afraid of the sun, afraid of the silence, and afraid of the man the world had taught me to see as a savage. I took the work because I had no other choice. It was a simple transaction, my labor in exchange for food and a roof over my head, nothing more." She fell silent for a moment, and in that silence, Davies could almost hear the whisper of the wind across a lonely, sun-baked clearing. He saw the flicker of a long dead fire in the depths of her old, clear eyes. Abigail raised her hand, the one that wore the bracelet, and touched the smooth, cool silver with the fingers of her other hand. It was a gesture of profound and unconscious tenderness. "Caring for an 80-year-old Apache was just a job," she said, her voice now barely a whisper. Yet it filled the small room with the weight of a lifetime, until what happened changed my life forever. The young journalist put down his pen. He had no more questions. He had come seeking a story about the changing West and had found instead a story about the unchanged human heart. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had just heard the truest thing he would ever write. He left as the first stars were beginning to appear, a handful of diamonds cast upon dark velvet. Abigail stood in the doorway and watched him go. Then she turned and went back inside her small, quiet school. The legacy built not of stone and timber, but of memory and love. Miles away, and 20 years in the past, the desert kept its own counsel. The place where the cabin had stood was now only a slight depression in the earth, a scar slowly being healed by tough grasses and resilient wildflowers. The wind, the same wind that had taught a young woman its secrets, blew softly through the branches of a gnarled mesquite tree that had grown up near the site. It moved across a low, unobtrusive mound of earth, a grave that had become almost indistinguishable from the land itself. The sunstone that marked it was weathered and gray, home to a small, green lizard that blinked in the last rays of the setting sun. As the final, brilliant sliver of the sun touched the horizon, its light shot across the desert floor, a final, fleeting kiss of fire. It struck the sunstone on the anonymous grave, and for a single, breathtaking moment, a vein of quartz embedded deep within the rock caught the light and blazed with a flash of pure, incandescent silver. It shone with a fierce and holy light, a beacon in the gathering twilight, a promise kept, a spirit that had not departed but had simply gone home into the land that had always loved it. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.